There is a lock of hair at the center of the strongest life that was ever lived, and it is almost nothing at all. 7 braids of dark, uncut hair hanging heavy against the neck of a young man, never once touched by a blade from the day he drew his first breath. The man who wore them could take hold of a full-grown lion as it sprang at his throat and tear it apart with his bare hands, the way another man would tear a young goat, and he had nothing in his hand at all. He could snap new ropes off his wrists as if they were threads scorched in a fire. He once killed 1,000 armed men in a single afternoon, on foot, with no weapon but the jawbone of a dead donkey. When his enemies shut him inside a walled city and set an ambush at the gate to cut him down at first light, he rose at midnight instead. He took hold of the great city gates, the 2 doors, the posts, the bar and all, and tore them bodily out of the wall and carried them up on his shoulders to the top of a hill. No army could stand against him. No chain could hold him. No wall could keep him in. So how do you bring down a man like that? Not with soldiers, because whole armies had already tried and failed. Not with iron, because iron snapped off him like burnt string. How was the strongest man who ever lived finally brought to his knees, blind and in chains, not by an army but by a whisper in the dark, and by a secret that was hidden, the whole time in his own uncut hair? This is the story of Samson, the strongest man who ever lived. Begin in a time when Israel had no king, and every man did whatever was right in his own eyes. It was the age of the judges, a long and violent stretch of years after Joshua had died, when the people of Israel had finally settled the land that was promised to them, and then, over and over, forgotten the God who had given it. The story turns like a wheel grinding in the dark. The people fall into the worship of the gods of the nations around them. God hands them over to an enemy. They suffer under that enemy until they cry out. And God, in mercy, raises up a deliverer, a judge, to break the yoke off their necks. And then, when the danger has passed, they forget again, and the wheel begins another turn. This time the enemy was the Philistines. They were a hard people of iron who had come across the sea and settled the coast in 5 walled cities, and their god was Dagon, an idol of a man above and a fish below. They knew the secret of forging iron and guarded it jealously, so that their weapons and their chariots were of iron, while Israel still scratched the ground with tools of bronze. And for 40 long years, the Philistines had ruled over Israel. It was a slow and comfortable kind of slavery, and that was the worst thing about it. There was no single great battle, no burning of cities, only a steady grinding pressure year after year, until a whole generation had grown up knowing nothing but the Philistine boot on their neck. Most of Israel had stopped even praying to be free. They had made their peace with the chains. That is the country into which the strongest man in the world was about to be born. In a small hill town called Zorah, among the tribe of Dan, there lived a man named Manoah, and a wife who had borne him no children. She was barren, and in that world a childless woman carried her empty arms through the streets like a public grief, year after year, with no hope that anything would ever change. And then, one ordinary day, out in a field, the change came to her. A man of God appeared to her, and the record says his face was like the face of the angel of God, terrible and shining, and she was afraid. He did not ask her for anything. He came only to make her a promise. "You are barren and have had no children," he told her, "but you shall conceive and bear a son." Then he laid a strange and heavy condition on the child, before the child even existed. "No razor is to come on his head," the angel said, for the boy shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb. She herself was to drink no wine and eat nothing unclean while she carried him. And this son, the messenger said, will begin to save Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. To be a Nazirite was to be set apart, wholly given over to God by a solemn vow, and the vow had 3 signs. He would drink no wine and touch nothing from the vine. He would never go near a dead body, and above all, no blade would ever touch his hair. The long, uncut hair was the outward sign of the whole vow, a banner every man could see, declaring that this life did not belong to itself. It belonged to God. Remember that, because everything turns on it. The hair was never the source of the strength. It was only the sign of the vow that the strength was given under. Manoah begged to see the man again, and God was gracious, and the angel returned. They prepared an offering on a rock, and as the flame went up toward heaven, the angel of the Lord went up in the flame of the altar, and Manoah and his wife fell on their faces to the ground. "We shall surely die," Manoah said, "for we have seen God." But they did not die. In time the woman bore a son, and she called his name Samson. And the boy grew. And the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. But the boy grew into a man who was a riddle even to the people he was born to save. The strength in him was without equal on the earth. The self-control was not there at all. God had given him a body no enemy could break, and Samson never once managed to master the one man who could destroy him, which was himself. The first thing we ever see the grown man do is follow his eyes. Samson went down to a Philistine town called Timnah, and there he saw a Philistine woman, one of the daughters of the very people oppressing his own. He came home and told his father and mother plainly. "I saw a woman in Timnah," he said. "Now get her for me as my wife." His parents were appalled. Was there no woman among his own people, among all Israel, that he had to go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson would not hear it. "Get her for me," he said, "for she is right in my eyes." And there, in that one sentence, is the whole tragedy of the man in miniature. Not what is right. What is right in my eyes. The strongest man alive was ruled, from the very beginning, by whatever he happened to be looking at. What neither he nor his parents could see was that God was at work even inside that stubborn appetite, for the record quietly says it was of the Lord, who was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. This is one of the hardest truths in the whole account. God can weave even a man's weakness into his own purpose, but the weakness is still the man's, and it will still, in the end, cost him everything. An appetite God can use is still an appetite that can kill you. On the road down to Timnah, alone, it happened for the first time. A young lion came roaring out at him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as easily as a man tears a young goat, and he had nothing in his hand. And here is the first strange note of the man's whole life. He told no one, not his father, not his mother. He walked away from the impossible thing as if it were nothing, and kept it to himself. Sometime later, going back down to marry the woman, he turned off the road to look at the carcass of the lion, and in the dry bones a swarm of bees had made a hive, and there was honey inside it. He scraped the honey out with his hands and ate as he walked, and gave some to his parents, and never told them he had taken it out of the body of a dead lion. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the killer, something sweet. He was already turning his own deeds into a private game. At the wedding, there was a 7-day feast, and 30 young Philistine men were brought in as his companions, which was as much a guard as an honor. And Samson, sure of himself, turned the feast into a wager. "Let me put a riddle to you," he said. "If you can solve it in 7 days, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And if you cannot, you will give the same to me." They agreed. "Out of the eater came something to eat," he said. "Out of the strong came something sweet." For 3 days they could not solve it, and their pride turned to menace. They went to his new bride and threatened her. "Coax the answer out of your husband," they said, "or we will burn you and your father's house with fire." So she wept on Samson through the rest of the feast, day and night, until on the 7th day, worn down, he told her, and she told her people. Before sunset, the men came to him with their answer. "What is sweeter than honey?" they said, "and what is stronger than a lion?" Samson knew at once he had been betrayed, and something cold and dangerous woke up in him. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he told them, "you would not have solved my riddle." And the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him again, but now it drove him into slaughter. He went down to the coastal city of Ashkelon, struck down 30 Philistine men there, stripped them, and paid his debt with the dead men's clothes. Then he went back up to his father's house in a burning rage, and his bride was quietly given away to another man. So the long war began, over a riddle and a wager, exactly as God had intended, and exactly as Samson never planned. When his anger cooled, Samson went back down to claim his wife, and found the door shut. Her father had given her to Samson's own best man. "Take the younger sister instead," he offered. "She is prettier." And that was the spark. This time Samson said, "I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines." What he did next has never been forgotten. He went out and caught 300 foxes, tied them together tail to tail in pairs, fastened a burning torch between each pair, and turned them loose into the standing grain of the Philistines. The fields went up in a single running wall of fire. The cut sheaves, the standing grain, the vineyards and the olive groves, the whole harvest of a nation burning at once, dragged in every direction by 300 terrified animals. When the Philistines learned it was Samson, and why, they took a darker revenge. They came for the woman he had done it all for, and they burned her and her father alive, the very death her people had once threatened her with to save themselves. Samson's grief turned to fury. "Because you have done this," he told them, "I will be avenged on you, and after that I will stop." And he fell on them and struck them down in a great slaughter, hip and thigh, and then went and lived in a cleft in the rock of Etam, alone. The strongest man in Israel had become a one-man war, and the nation he was born to save was about to show him exactly how little it wanted to be saved. Because the Philistines then marched up into Judah to find him, and 3,000 men of Judah, his own countrymen, went down to the rock of Etam, not to join him, but to arrest him. "Do you not know the Philistines rule over us?" they said. "What is this you have done to us?" Here is the saddest picture in the whole story. Israel had grown so used to its chains that when God finally sent them a deliverer strong enough to break them, they came in their thousands, not to follow him, but to hand him over and keep the peace. Samson did not even fight them. "Swear to me, you will not kill me yourselves," he said. And he let his own people bind him with 2 new ropes and lead him down like a prisoner to the enemy. And when the Philistines came running and shouting to meet him, sure they finally had him, the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him one more time. the ropes on his arms became like flax burned in a fire, and they simply melted off his hands. He looked down, saw the fresh jawbone of a dead donkey lying in the dirt, snatched it up, and with that alone, he struck down 1,000 men. When it was over, he stood alone in a field of the dead and made a grim little song of it. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have struck down 1,000 men. And then, for the first time in his whole life, we hear him actually turn to God. He was dying of thirst, and instead of boasting, he cried out, and God split open a hollow in the ground, and water came out, and he drank and revived. He judged Israel 20 years. But the man who could crush 1,000 soldiers still could not say no to the pull of his own eyes. Which is how he ended up in Gaza, a walled Philistine stronghold, spending the night with a prostitute there. Word spread that Samson was inside the city, and the men of Gaza surrounded the house and lay in wait all night at the city gate, certain that at dawn, trapped behind their own walls, he would finally be theirs. But at midnight, Samson rose, walked to the gate, took hold of the 2 doors and their posts, and pulled the whole thing up out of the ground, bar and all. Then he lifted the gates of the city onto his shoulders and carried them to the top of a hill facing distant Hebron, and left them there, as if to say that no wall the Philistines could build would ever hold him. And that is the whole man, before the fall. Everything about Samson ran to excess, the strength and the appetite alike. He treated the most sacred vow in Israel like a private toy, drifting near dead lions, feasting with the enemy, chasing every woman his eyes fell on, spending a holy gift on riddles and rage and lust. He never once lost a fight, and he never, not once, won himself. The one enemy he could not tear apart with his bare hands was the one living inside his own chest. Before the secret is finally told, one thing. If this is the kind of story you were never told in church, subscribe. There is a new biblical film on this channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Now, back to Samson, at the very height of his strength, walking straight toward the one person in all the world who would finally learn how to take that strength away from him. After Gaza, the record says simply that he fell in love. There was a woman in the Valley of Sorek, and her name was Delilah, and Samson loved her. It is the only time in the whole account we are told he loved anyone, and it would be the death of him. Because the lords of the Philistines, all 5 of them, came quietly up to Delilah with an offer no one in that world could easily refuse. Coax him, they told her, and find out where his great strength lies and how we can overpower him and bind him and bring him low. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. It was a fortune many times over, one from each of the 5 cities. She weighed the man who loved her against the silver, and she chose the silver. And from that moment, every soft word out of her mouth was a knife. So she began to ask him, sweetly, over and over, "Tell me where your great strength lies," she said, "and how you could be bound and subdued." And Samson, who should have run, instead began to play with her. "Bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings," he said, "and I will become weak like any other man." The Philistines were already hidden in the room. She bound him and cried out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he snapped the bowstrings like a strand of yarn touched by fire. The secret was still safe, but he had started a game he could not win. She pouted that he had mocked her, and he gave her another lie, new ropes this time, and broke them off his arms like thread. A third time she pressed, and now he let her come dangerously close. "Weave the 7 braids of my hair into the loom," he said, "and fasten it with a pin." He was letting her touch the very sign of his vow, weaving the holy uncut hair into a Philistine loom as if it were a joke. She did it and cried the alarm again, and he woke and pulled the loom, pin and web and all, straight out of the wall. He was toying with the one thread that held his whole life together. Then Delilah stopped playing and went to work on his heart. "How can you say you love me," she said, "when your heart is not with me? 3 times now you have mocked me and not told me what makes you so strong." And she pressed him with her words day after day and urged him until, the record says, his soul was vexed to death. He was the strongest man on earth, and a woman wore him down with nothing but persistence and tears, the same way the men at his wedding had once broken his first wife. He had learned nothing. And at last, worn out, he told her everything from the heart. "No razor has ever come on my head," he said, "for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man." He handed her the one secret that was never his to give away, the sign of the vow that God had placed on him before he was even born. She heard it, and she knew, this time, that he had told her all his heart. She sent word to the lords one last time. "Come up this once," she said, "for he has told me everything." They came with the silver in their hands. She lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 braids of Samson's hair while the strongest man in the world slept like a child in her lap. And as the hair fell, his strength began to leave him, and he never stirred. Then she called it out for real. "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he woke and said the most terrible sentence in the whole story. "I will go out as at other times," he said, "and shake myself free." He genuinely did not know. He stood up expecting the old power to be there, as it always had been, ready to be spent like his own money. But the hair was gone, and the vow was broken. And the record lands the blow as gently and as devastatingly as it can. He did not know that the Lord had left him. "There is the whole secret," said plainly at last. "The strength was never in the hair. The strength was never Samson's at all. It was God's, lent to him under a vow. And the uncut hair was only the sign that the vow still stood. For 20 years he had been quietly breaking that vow, piece by piece, treating a holy gift like a private toy. And God, in patience, had left the power with him anyway. The razor did not cut his strength. The razor cut the last thread of a promise he had been unraveling for a lifetime. And when the sign was finally gone, so was the God behind it. What they did to him then was merciless. The Philistines seized him, and they gouged out his eyes, the eyes that had led him into every forbidden thing since Timnah, and put them out forever. They brought him down to Gaza, the very city whose gates he had once carried away, and bound him with shackles of bronze, and set him to grind grain at the mill in the prison. The strongest man who ever lived, blind in chains, walking in slow circles in the dark, doing the dumb, endless labor of an ox. But that was not the end of it. Because there is one more line in the record, small and easy to miss, and everything turns on it. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. The sign was quietly coming back, and down in that dark mill, blind and broken, and stripped of everything his strength had ever won him, it is likely that Samson finally did the one thing he had almost never done in all his years of power. With nothing left to trust in but God, he began at last to pray. Up above him, the Philistines threw a great festival to their god Dagon to celebrate. Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand, they sang, and the temple filled with lords and people, and 3,000 more crowded onto the roof to watch. And at the height of the drunken joy, someone called for the blind giant. "Bring out Samson, that he may entertain us." So they led him stumbling out of the dark by the hand, the terror of the Philistines reduced to a joke for a drunken crowd, and stood him between the two great pillars that held up the whole house. Samson turned to the boy who was leading him by the hand and asked one quiet thing. "Let me feel the pillars the house rests on," he said, "so I can lean against them." The boy set his hands on the two central columns, the ones bearing the entire weight of the temple and the thousands packed onto it. And there, blind, in chains, forgotten, the strongest man who ever lived braced one hand against each pillar and prayed the only prayer of his that the Bible records in full. "O Lord God," he said, "remember me. Strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. There is no boasting left in it, no riddle, no song. Just a blind man in the ruins of his own life, asking God for strength one last time, and asking for it, at the very end, from God, and not from himself. And God, who gives and forgives, answered him." Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars, one with his right hand and one with his left, and he leaned. "Let me die with the Philistines," he said, and he bowed with all his might, and the great house came down, the pillars, the roof, the lords, the 3,000 on the roof, and all the people inside, the whole weight of it crashing down into the dust in a single roar. And the record ends it with one unbearable line. "So the dead that he killed at his death were more than those he had killed in all his life." In the last blind moment of his life, with his hair grown back and his strength returned for one final act, Samson struck a greater blow against the enemy of his people than in all his 20 years of standing, seeing, boasting power. His brothers came and took his body from the rubble, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the tomb of Manoah his father, in the ground he had come from. And so we are left holding the same thing we started with, a lock of uncut hair. The strength was never Samson's to spend. It was a gift given under a vow, and the hair was only the sign that the gift still stood. He lived his whole life as though the power belonged to him, to throw away on his appetites, and the tragedy of the strongest man who ever lived is that the one who truly wasted him was not Delilah, and was not the Philistines, and was not even the razor in the dark. It was Samson. And there is a warning in it sharp enough to reach across 3,000 years. How many people carry a real gift, a strength, a talent, a faith, a love that was placed in them by God, and slowly come to believe it is simply their own, and go on spending it carelessly. Sure, it can never run dry. Never noticing the quiet moment when the source withdraws and leaves them holding only the shell, Samson stood up expecting the old power and found himself an ordinary, blinded man. He did not even feel it leave. And yet the story does not end in that dark mill. It ends with hair growing back in the shadows, and a broken man who had finally run all the way out of his own strength, discovering that God was still there to be asked. That is why this violent, wasteful, heartbreaking life is remembered. In the end, not as a warning only, but as one of the great stories of faith. Because the God who gives the strength turned out to be the same God who answers the man with nothing left. Samson broke one house of one enemy in one nation. But long before him, there was an hour when the God of Israel broke the mightiest empire on the whole earth, not with a strong man at all, but with an 80-year-old shepherd holding a wooden staff. Moses and the 10 plagues and the parting of the sea has its own story. It is the next film on this channel, and it is waiting for you now. If you want to know how one man with a shepherd's staff could face down the most powerful ruler on earth, what the 10 plagues really were and why each one struck at a god of Egypt, and how the sea itself split open into a road so that a whole nation could walk through on dry ground, subscribe, and I will see you there.